Hello and welcome to my video all about how to sew a slip stitch seam. Here I have a piece of medium weight fabric that I'm going to demonstrate on. I have folded over and ironed each side of the seam and I'm going to be stitching these two folds together. The slip stitch is often referred to as the ladder stitch, and as you can see from this diagram I've made, it's easy to see why. Because the thread forms a ladder-like pattern. The slip stitch is also referred to as the invisible stitch, and that highlights the biggest advantage of the slip stitch, which is that it's practically invisible from the inside and the outside of your project. That's what makes it such a popular technique, and you'll often see it used for closing up openings in things like stuffed toys and pillows. Because the slip stitch is designed to be as invisible as possible, you should use a thread that matches the fabric that you're sewing. So in my case, what I should be using is a regular sewing thread in white. But because I want you to see this demo clearly, I'm going to be using a contrasting thread instead. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is cut a piece of thread and add a regular knot at one end and feed the other end through a hand sewing needle. As a guide, I usually use a piece of thread that's at least 4 or 5 times the length of the edge that I'm going to sew, bearing in mind that it's always best to overestimate. To start stitching, I take my needle from inside the folded over edge of fabric and bring it up out of the top of the fold. This hides the knot within the fold so it's not visible. In order to make the start of the thread extra secure, I then like to do a small stitch, like so, and pull the thread until there's only a small loop remaining. I then take the needle through that loop and tighten. And that just adds an extra level of security at the beginning of my stitching. I then take my needle across the seam, straight across from where the needle just emerged from the fold. I then take the needle down into the fold on this side of the seam. You then feed the needle underneath and parallel to that fold. Usually you want to travel between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch along the seam edge. So when you've fed the needle along a certain distance, you then make it emerge from the top of the fold. The shorter and closer together you keep your stitches, the stronger the stitching is going to be. And it's also better to keep the stitches close together when you're sewing fine or thin fabrics. And then you repeat those same steps. So you go straight across to the other side of the seam, then you push the needle into the fold, feed it underneath the fold for the same distance as before, and then push the needle up through the fold again. And then again you go straight across to the other side of the seam and down through the folded edge. And so on all the way to the end of the seam. Even though it's important to keep the stitch length consistent all along the seam, I'm going to start by making fairly long stitches, and then about halfway along the seam I'm going to switch to shorter stitches. This is purely so I can compare the results at the end of the demo, but obviously you'd pick one stitch length and stick to it. You'll notice that when I say come up through the top of the fold, what I do is come up just inside the fold. By stitching just inside those folded edges, rather than directly on the fold, I ensure that they are as invisible as I can possibly make them. When I've finished stitching, what I like to do is take the needle across the seam, as usual, but this time I just do a very short stitch. I then go back on myself and do another stitch in the same place. I tighten the thread until there's just a small loop remaining. I take the needle through that loop and tighten. I then repeat those steps by doing another short stitch in the same place, pulling the thread until there's just a small loop and taking the needle through that loop and tightening. And that secures the thread. I then take the needle inside the seam and push it out through one side of the fabric before cutting off the excess thread. This hides the tail of thread in between the fabric layers. And that is the slip stitch seam completed. I'm now going to compare the strength of the small stitches versus the long stitches. As you can see, I can force the seam apart a bit more where the long stitches are, and it's also a bit easier to do so, which confirms the point that if you want a stronger seam, then you'll make shorter stitches. And that's it, that's the end of my video tutorial. I really hope it's been useful to you, and thank you very much for watching.